The National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture at Alabama State University, through the Voting Rights Research Repository Project, is sponsoring a 3-panel series entitled Civic Engagement in the COVID Era and Beyond. During these discussions, our guests will express a number of opinions that do not necessarily reflect those of the National Center or Alabama State University. However, we are happy to invite a vigorous dialogue of diverse opinions among our panelists and hope that these conversations inspire our audience to engage critical civic issues facing our state and our nation. Hello, I am Dr. Howard Robinson, Alabama State University archivist and historian. Today, we have assembled a particularly informative panel to discuss civic engagement in the COVID era and beyond, absentee voting, convenience, or corruption. Our distinguished group of politicians, political organizers, and community activists include John Merrill, Alabama Secretary of State, John Knight, candidate for the Alabama Senate, seat 26, and Gina Ishman, Circuit Clerk for Montgomery County. To provide context, Alabama's Secretary of State is expecting somewhere around 200,000 absentee ballots to be cast in this November election in Alabama. The Secretary of State's office has extended the time for Alabamians to apply for an absentee ballot by more than 100 days. Moreover, voters with COVID-19 concerns were able to mark the box citing a physical illness or infirmity when applying for an absentee ballot. In this election cycle, the debate over absentee voting and or mail-in voting has been intensely contested. While 33 states across the nation allow a citizen to cast an absentee ballot without stating a reason, Democrats in Alabama were unsuccessful in 3 separate attempts to push through legislation allowing no excuse absentee voting. In 9 states and the District of Columbia, every registered voter will be mailed a ballot ahead of the election. During this pandemic, the Secretary of State of Alabama has supported legislation allowing people to request ballots without having to cite a reason. However, he has argued that costs prohibit Alabama from adopting a full-blown mail-in system. Several interest groups, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, and the Alabama Disability Advocacy Program, filed lawsuits claiming rules governing absentee voting in Alabama were too restrictive. This includes rules against curbside voting, rules against requiring photo IDs for citizens 65 years or older or persons with a disability, and witness requirements for absentee ballots cast in 3 of Alabama's most populous counties. Both the U.S. District Court and the Federal Appeals Court barred the state of Alabama from interfering with curbside voting and suspended witness requirements for absentee ballots in those 3 Alabama counties. The U.S. Supreme Court then granted Alabama's request to stay the federal judge's order. However, for this November 2020 election, subsequent litigation has stopped the state of Alabama from interfering with counties who wish to make absentee voting easier and, some would say, less secure during this pandemic. So Alabama counties can now loosen requirements that an absentee ballot be notarized or countersigned by 2 witnesses. Counties can also allow citizens or senior citizens, as well as the disabled, to submit absentee ballots without state-issued IDs, and counties can allow curbside collection of ballots. The Federal Elections Commission denies that any significant fraud associated with absentee or mail-in voting occurs. What is far more significant is that every year, thousands of mail-in ballots are not counted due to voter error. Around the nation, 550,000 ballots received by mail were disqualified in the 2020 primaries. The state of Alabama notifies voters when and allows them to fix applications that have been disqualified because of missteps in the process. The state does not, however, provide the same opportunity to correct irregularities once an absentee ballot has been submitted. So again, to facilitate this discussion, we have on our panel Secretary of State John H. Merrill. He's been Secretary of State since 1915. John Merrill has traveled to Russia in September of 2016 as a monitor during their parliamentary elections. John Merrill has also served in the House of Representatives between 2010 and 2014. And then in the House of Representatives, he served on several committees, including the Constitution and Campaigns Election Committee and the Economic Development and Tourism Committee. He also, prior to his service in the House of Representatives, was the Business Development Officer at First Federal Bank of Tuscaloosa. John Knight, who's now a candidate for the Alabama Senate, seat 26, served in the House of Representatives for 26 years between 1992 and 2018. During his stint, he was chair of the General Fund Committee, vice chair of the Montgomery Legislation Committee, and the ranking minority member of the Internal Affairs Committee. He also has served as chair of the Montgomery Democratic Conference, and he serves as chair of the board of directors of the Montgomery Housing Authority. To round out our panel, we have Gina Ishman, Circuit Clerk for Montgomery County since 2018. As Circuit Clerk, she is the absentee election manager for Montgomery County, but she's also served as the deputy clerk for the Montgomery Circuit Clerk's office for 4 years between 2014 and 2018. And she is the former director of facilities management for the Dunn Oliver Aquadome at Alabama State University. So, good afternoon, panelists. Today's conversation will last about an hour and will be divided into 3 segments. So first, we will define absentee voting. Second, we'll look at a discussion over the mechanics of absentee voting in Alabama. And lastly, we will look at a critique of absentee and mail-in voting for our guest. During the discussion, I will ask a series of questions and may direct those questions at a specific person, but I want you to feel comfortable to chime in on these questions. Other panelists can chime in on the question as well. So let's begin our discussion in terms of defining absentee voting. And I want to turn to you, Secretary Merrill. Discuss for us the difference between absentee voting and mail-in voting.
Well, there's a significant difference between absentee voting and absentee voting in person, absentee voting by mail, and then voting through mail exclusively, whether it be universal vote by mail or, as the president has come to call it recently, unsolicited voting by mail. So let's talk about universal vote by mail first. Universal vote by mail means that in the particular state where an individual would be a resident, every registered voter in that state would receive a ballot mailed to them, whether they requested one or not. That would enable that voter to be able to return that ballot at their leisure. The ballot would be mailed to the location that is on the voter's address line on the voter rolls. It's as simple as that. Now, absentee voting by mail or absentee voting in person would require that the voter request that an absentee ballot be mailed to them, or they could show up at the absentee election manager's office, and then at that point, that individual would be able to make application. They'd have to submit a copy of their valid photo ID. Once that occurs, then that would be processed. If it's being done in person, it'd be done immediately, and then they would receive their ballot. They would mark their ballot for the candidate of their choice. They would place it in the secrecy envelope. Then they would place it in the return envelope. The return envelope has to be notarized, or it has to be witnessed by 2 individuals. And then at that point, it would be placed in the mail envelope. And if it's dropped in the Postal Service mailbox with the correct postage, it would go to the absentee election manager. However, we also have allowed other options for it to be returned now through UPS or FedEx or DHL or another nationally, regionally, or local recognized carrier. So those are the options, but it's only available for those voters that request it.
Okay. I do want to ask a follow-up question in terms of is this the way that absentee balloting has traditionally worked in Alabama, or has the rules changed for this particular cycle?
That's a question. Now, one of the things I did not touch on because you did in your introduction is that in order to make application, you have to submit a reason why you're voting absentee. And there's about 10 different reasons for the voter to list. One of those 10 will qualify. But because we're in a declared state of emergency, Title 17-11-3 grants me the ability as the Secretary of State to assign a reason for people to vote absentee. And so we selected the reason that says I'm ill or infirmed and unable to appear at my polling site on election day. When you check that box, then at that point, that counts as your excuse. However, we streamlined the process in 2019 and actually made the reasons more acceptable other than the reasons that had been used for years and years and years. Another thing that we did in 2019, and that legislation was actually introduced and carried by Senator Roger Smitherman from Birmingham, is that we were able to add the photo ID component at the front of the process. So when you make application, you submit your ID, as opposed to what it used to be, which is when you returned your ballot, you returned your ID. The reason that we made the change is because when you go to vote, you don't give them your ID when you're turning your ballot in the tabulator. You give them your ID when you go to check in. So this makes it consistent in the process as if you're voting in person.
Okay, thank you. Representative Knight, you're involved in a campaign as we speak. Could you talk to us about how absentee voting factors into a contemporary political campaign?
Well, there's no question that absentee voting, just turnout at the polls, certainly a factor into a campaign. But let's go back to the Alabama Constitution. In the Alabama Constitution, and I don't quote the Constitution that often, but it gives every citizen in Alabama a right to vote. If you have a right to vote, then why should the state of Alabama make it so difficult for you to be able to vote and to vote conveniently? And that's the thing that we have argued for a number of times, and especially on the absentee end of it. It shouldn't be difficult to do it. We should be encouraging people to go to the polls and vote. Now, I will commend Secretary Merrill on the emergency order. There are some things that's been done, but I think he's fully aware of the arguments that we've had throughout the years in terms of trying to make certain that everybody would have an opportunity to go to the polls and cast their votes, or cast their votes, period. It's extremely difficult in some elections, especially large elections. I have seen where people will come, they stand in line, and they only offer an hour to go vote. And some of them don't get a chance to vote because the line was so long. There have been times when the problems at the polling place itself. So why is it that we can't have early voting as a matter of practice? And it could have been done through this pandemic because of the emergency orders. I think, Secretary, I think you could have done that per the order if you wanted to do it. But we are continuing to make it difficult. It's a little easier now, but there's so much that still needs to be done to make certain that everybody can exercise their right.
Okay. So now you made a distinction that I had not yet, and I'd like to build on that distinction, and that is the discussion of early voting. And it seems like in this election, the concept of early voting and absentee voting have been commingled. I voted in Montgomery County, and I filled out an absentee ballot at the courthouse and handed it in. And so I did that early, but it was in the form of an absentee ballot. So have the two been commingled through this process?
I don't know, Secretary may be able to answer that one.
Yes.
Well, let me respond to this too. And you know, I have a great deal of respect for the chairman. I served with him for 4 years in the Alabama legislature. I consider him a friend. And of course, he's entitled to his own opinion, but he's not entitled to his own facts. And what are the facts? And the facts are that since I became the Secretary of State, which is 5 years, 8 months, and 20 days ago, not only have we broken every record in the history of the state For voter registration, we've broken every record in the history of the state for voter participation. And we've been doing it the same way that we've done it in the past, except we put in some new efficiencies. One of those things that we've done is we've enabled people who want to vote early in person through the absentee process to be able to do so. One of the things he may not be aware of is the highest number of absentee ballots that's ever been cast in the history of the state is 89,000. However, as of yesterday, we exceeded 91,140 ballots that have already been successfully returned. So we're going to shatter the record. We will be north of 200,000 absentee ballots that are successfully returned in this election. Why is that important? It's important because people are not having a hard time getting to the polls, and people are not having a hard time casting their ballot early through the absentee process. We just want to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat.
You know, and your response, Secretary Merrill, has made me think about this query, and this is for both you and Representative Knight, and that is, and I looked at those statistics in terms of the increased access, increased voting percentages in Alabama, and are you directly correlating that to efforts in the Secretary of State's office in the state of Alabama, or are there other factors that come into play in terms of growing the vote in Alabama?
Oh, no, sir. There's no other factors, because one of the things that we've done, if you go back to 2015 and you look at our ad campaign that we began, we have registered 1,693,874 new voters since January the 19th, 2015. We now have a state record 3,681,476 registered voters in the state of Alabama. Those numbers are unprecedented and unparalleled in the history of our state. And we have broken records in 6 consecutive elections that we've had. Every time we've had an election, going back to the March 1st primary in 2016, we've broken a record for participation the next time we've had a similar election of similar style. We're going to break that election record once again on November the 3rd. We'll be north of 2.5 million, maybe as high as 2.8 million people going to the polls and casting their ballot through the absentee process or through in-person voting.
And that's out of a potential or total pool of how many eligible voters in Alabama?
There's 4.8 million people, but 96% of all eligible African Americans in Alabama are currently registered to vote. 91% of all eligible white Alabamians are registered, and 94% of all eligible Alabamians are registered to vote.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit as just probably the last question in this section, but I wanted to look at I want both you, and this question is directed at both Secretary Merrill and Representative Knight. Would you support mail-in voting in Alabama? And if so, how would you address the fiscal demands such an initiative would require? Would either one of you support mail-in voting? And that is where, well, in terms of where the entire system, is votes through the mail-in process.
Yes, I do not support universal vote by mail or unsolicited vote by mail as it's being done in Colorado, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, or Utah. Those are the only 5 states in the union that currently do it. I will also tell you there are other states that are attempting to do it, but all of those that are attempting to do it have had at least one major problem since they started the process in this cycle. Now, the 5 states that I just mentioned to you, the 3 that do it best are Oregon, Washington, and Colorado, and they will tell you that in order to initiate the process, your state should be returning mail at a 60% rate. Alabama currently returns election mail at a 4% rate. They will also tell you that it takes 5 years for full implementation of the process, not 5 months, but 5 years. And so we're nowhere near that. The other thing that you need to know is that in order to conduct an election in Alabama, each segment of the election costs $5.5 million per segment. So $5.5 million for the primary, $5.5 million for the runoff, $5.5 million for the general. One segment of universal vote by mail in Alabama would cost the state $18.5 million. So there's a difference between $60 million in the full administration of a universal vote by mail effort as opposed to $16.5 million the way we do it now. And we're breaking records for participation in the state. No other state in the union has done what we've done in that period of time.
Okay, I'd like to move to our segment on the mechanics of absentee voting in Alabama. And to start off a conversation in this segment, I'd like to turn to Gina Ishman. As the state rules direct what happens at the local level, discuss for us, please, how directives governing absentee balloting are implemented in your office on the ground. So we'd like you to give us a real world feel for how this process is working out.
Well, good evening, and I just want to say good afternoon, rather, to Secretary of State John Merrill, Dr. Knight. Thank you for allowing me to be on this panel. Look, taking a break. Absentee voting has been very busy throughout Alabama and been very busy in Montgomery County. And we have been flexible with assisting voters who are choosing to vote absentee process. I think you talked about it earlier. Speaking of record numbers, we had record numbers yesterday. I had 500 voters choose to come in person to vote by absentee. And we had an additional 400 requests mailed in to vote absentee. So I'm excited to see people taking advantage of the absentee voting process. And we are going to exceed numbers. We've already done 13,000 ballots, sent out 13,000 ballots in Montgomery County. So we've been flexible. We have made accommodations in the courthouse for parking with the high volume of voters that we're getting coming in person. We've made accommodations for additional voting booths for voters. As Secretary John Merrill stated earlier, you have that application. So we have applications in our office. We have copy machines in the hallway to assist voters with making copies of their driver's license or valid photo ID. So we have made every accommodation we can to assist voters who are coming in person and assisting those voters who are choosing to do it by mail. So we've been very flexible. We've been assisting with communication to voters here in Montgomery. Whether it's through social media, whether it's through other voter engagement programs. I've recently sent something out countywide here in Montgomery, just reminding people of the deadlines, reminding people that if they are choosing to vote absentee for this general election, do it now. Don't wait till the last minute. And what box is the appropriate box to check on that application?
You know, I actually personally see you at a number of functions, voting related functions. I think you've taken a real I'm talking to you, Gina Ishman, taking a real hands-on approach to implementing the absentee ballot voting system in this COVID era. So what do you see as the strengths and the weaknesses of this process?
Well, I appreciate that, Dr. Robinson. I care about the citizens here in Montgomery County. And one of the strengths is, I think, with the emergency order, that any voter who chooses to vote the absentee process, if they check that reason, I have a physical illness or infirmity, they can vote absentee. So one of the strengths is it gives voters choices. They have options. They can decide today, if they are unsure about going to the polls on election day, that the absentee voting process is there for them. No, Alabama doesn't have early voting, but voters can request to receive an absentee ballot and check the appropriate box for that reason, and they can vote prior to election day. So one of the strengths is it gives voters that option of voting prior to the election day. And we all know with the weaknesses of the absentee voting process, there are those requirements that we've often talked about. They have to get a copy of their ID. But again, we assist the voters here in Montgomery County with getting a copy of their ID. In addition, we can assist with the witnessing requirements. We have notaries in our office. I'm a notary. We have several workers in our office who can witness. What we're seeing more than we have before is those voters who are receiving their absentee ballot by mail, they're choosing to hand deliver those voted ballots back to our office. And so we can assist with the witness requirement. We are we'll be doing extended hours for that based off of the volume. So on Saturdays, the next 2 Saturdays leading up to the deadline, voters can choose to come in person to hand deliver their ballots. So even though there's strengths and weaknesses, we're being very flexible and making as many accommodations to voters.
One of the issues, I think, is I articulated it earlier in my introduction, and I think that is mistakes that voters are making both in the application process and in the ballot process. And I understand that ballots in Alabama, they won't be opened or counted until the election day, right?
That is correct.
All right. So, but from previous elections, do we have a feel for the statistics that discuss what percentage or what number of ballots or what number of applications are defective or there's some mistake and they cannot be counted? That data is collected at the local level, not the state level. Am I correct?
Correct.
Okay. So does your office have a feel for the one? And I think that if a voter submits an application and there's something wrong or defective with that application, they can be prompted to correct those inaccuracies on the application. But this is not the case, again, with the ballot. Do we have any feel for how many or what percentage of ballots that are submitted by voters in Alabama or in Montgomery County are defective and cannot be counted?
Okay. So let me explain the process to you a little bit more, Dr. Robinson. So my office is responsible for receiving those applications and making sure those applications are valid and meet all the requirements. And before we send that voter an absentee ballot, we do have responses that if an application is received, such as they didn't check a reason, they didn't provide a copy of their ID, they mailed multiple applications in one envelope, that we do send those applications back to allow that voter to correct that application so that we can process it. Now, as we are accepting ballots in, remember, these ballots are not turned over to the poll workers until election day. So to make a determination now as to what ballots will be counted, that's not what the role of my office will do. Those ballots are turned over to poll workers. There's a set of poll workers that come in on election day. There's a chief inspector, and they will review that affidavit envelope. And I've spoke about it plenty of times before, and part of my communication is affidavit envelope. That voter must complete it, sign it, and make sure that it's witnessed. I will say in previous elections, I've seen one is too many, but it's been about a 10% of the ballots that we received back that, from my understanding from the poll workers and provisional ballots that we turned over to the Board of Registers, that's about the percentage.
Would you like to chime in on that, Secretary Merrill, from the view of the state? I'm not sure. Are you hearing me? Okay. I think you might be muted. Are you muted, Secretary Merrill? I'm not hearing Secretary Merrill. Well, let's turn to our next section. We want to come back and address that question with Secretary Merrill when his microphone is working correctly. But in light of that, we're going to move forward and move into our last component or last segment, and really the critical and most important, I think, part of this conversation, and that is these critiques or the critique on absentee and mail-in voting. And I want to address this. I guess we could start with Representative Knight, and then when Secretary Merrill's microphone is corrected, issue is corrected, then we'll move to Merrill. But do you think it is prudent to expand absentee balloting in the light of so many disqualified mail-in ballots? Representative Knight, could you address that? Do we continue to deal with mail-in voting or absentee balloting, and in light of all of these the irregularities with voters not understanding or doing something wrong in the system?
Well, I was trying to respond to the secretary earlier there and couldn't get in, evidently mute or something. But this is no indictment on the clerk or the secretary in terms of the effort that we put forth to try to get more people to register, to get more people to vote. People have fought, they have marched, and they have died for the precious right just to vote in Alabama. The Alabama Constitution and many statutes have prohibited that in many years. So the effort now is to make it easy for people to cast their vote. Now, the absentee process is not easy. The Constitution doesn't say that you got to give a reason why you want to vote. It says you don't have to have a reason to vote. You vote because you are a citizen of Alabama and you have a right to vote. So what we are advocating is that this should be as easy as possible. There's no indictment on the way that the process is working at the present time. Sure, certainly, more people are voting absentee, more people are voting, they put reason down, they use the reason now because of the pandemic, those types of things. So, but people should be allowed to vote early. That the clerk can't change that. The second would be the Constitution and the Alabama legislature. But this could have been changed during this pandemic because the secretary and the governor had the authority to do away with some of the laws that's on and make it much easier than what it is. Just because there has been an increase recently, it does not mean that, and the secretary has done a good job, he got a good PR campaign, but there is still so much that needs to be done as it relates to allowing people to vote. And on the absentee process itself, there's a stigma there because there are still people that feel like if they don't come in person and vote, if they vote absentee, it's going to be questioned. They're going to be singled out. They're going to be prosecuted and things of that nature. So you still got all of that voter suppression going on when it comes to the entire process. Our position is that we would like to have early voting in the state. And that's something that we have been pushing for a number of years and trying to get bills passed to do that. So hopefully,
can you talk to us? Can you talk to us about early voting? What do you mean by early voting? How would that look? When does it start? What are the requirements? So talk to me about the type of early voting that you all want to see implemented.
It's happening in states across the country now, and you can set your own rules and regulations. Basically, the legislature or Secretary of State and working together to make certain that we have early voting in the state. And what that would do is mean that if whatever date the election is on, that you'll be able to vote prior to that, and you'll be able to vote by mail. So or vote early, either one. Now, mail-in voting, we're for that as well. But it seems like there's more opposition to that. But at least if we don't get mail-in voting, we should have early voting. And this reason for voting early, you should not have to say a reason because people are concerned that if they put a reason down there and that they are questioned that there is a problem with it. Or people are concerned that if you put a reason down there and they come back and challenge it, they may say, well, you could have voted on election day. So those are the type of things that people are concerned about.
Okay. I wanted to look at it. We of course have a partisan system, and there seems to have been a clear division when it comes to the efficacy of absentee voting along partisan lines. What do you think is the root cause? And this is both for Knight and Merrill. What do you think is the root cause of opposition to these various devices to expand or to make voting easier and again, some would say less secure? And either Knight or Merrill, Secretary Merrill, can you have your issues been cleared up? Can we hear you now?
Hear me now?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Outstanding. Look, one of the things that Chairman Knight shared earlier that I know he probably was not aware of this, but Title 17-11-4 makes clear that I am not able to change the law. And so removing the opportunity to have early in-person voting or granting that privilege for people is not something that exists in state law. So that's something that has to be done by members of the legislature. I'm confident that if
No,
the chair of the Senate,
I don't think.
Representative Knight, we're going to let Merrill finish, and then I want to let you address. I'm going to let you respond to that. But go on, Secretary Merrill.
one of the first bills that he's going to introduce is to have early in-person voting. But I do think that it's also important to note that there are a number of people who are opposed to early in-person voting, and there are people who are supportive of early in-person voting. However, the two things that need to be noted is that in no state in the union that has early in-person voting has voting participation increased. Not one time in any state in the union. What they've done is they've just simply spread out the number of people who are voting, and they've done that over a longer period of time. Thus, in each instance, cost has increased in every state in the union that has early in-person voting. So if you're increasing the cost for everybody, but for the benefit of the few to vote early in person, what is the benefit to the overall community? That's the question that has to be answered.
Okay, Representative Knight, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, we have disagreed on a number of issues, and we work together on a number of issues. So we're going to disagree on this one. I do think that the statute gives you the. Now, that's something that we could fight out in court whether or not you had the authority or not, but it's over with. But I do think you had the authority to do so based on the emergency order. Now, without the emergency order, no, you would not have had the authority. But under the emergency order, I take the position that you had the authority to do so.
Okay, I do want to go revisit, just to be clear, that the question I posed, and that is, in our partisan system, we've seen a clear division when it comes to access to or absentee voting or early voting and other mechanisms, curbside voting, and the like. What do you think are the root causes or the root rationale for support or opposition to these developments or these voting mechanisms?
You mean oppositions to the mechanism?
Opposition to, so what generates, or what is at the base, or what is driving the opposition to absentee voting, curbside voting, early voting, mail-in voting? The Secretary of State has mentioned security. He's mentioned that it doesn't, the cost, and that it doesn't increase by any significant measure the number of people who participate in the electoral process. Is that our understanding?
Well, we're looking at more than just counting numbers. We want to increase the participation. We want everybody to exercise their right, but we think it should be convenient. It shouldn't be something where you have to struggle or you have to sacrifice or you have to be subjected to going back to work within an hour, or you can't get off a certain time. Those are the type of things that we are trying to eliminate to make it so that we would follow the directions of the Alabama Constitution. I keep going back to that because so often I think people forget that the Constitution, unlike even the U.S. Constitution, in the Alabama Constitution, is that we have a right to vote. I think the Secretary, we can agree on that today, right?
Oh, yes, sir.
Okay.
Now,
so
but
it's easy.
Hear me?
Yes. Go on, Secretary Merrill.
Yes, but I do think that it's important to make sure that we understand. The chairman continues to talk about how difficult it is for some people to vote, but it's obviously not difficult for many people to vote, because if it was, we would not continue not only to break, but to shatter records for voter registration and voter participation every time we have an election. I mean, that's never happened in the history of the state, and it's happened every year that I've been the secretary, because we've made a concerted effort, and the chairman can tell you, Lord, he's been involved for so long. He has done a tremendous job representing his people in the legislature. He hopes to do so again, but he can tell you there's never been an office like the Office of the Secretary of State today where we have worked extraordinarily hard to ensure that everybody that wants to participate in the electoral process has the opportunity to do so without any impediments whatsoever. we're going to continue to do that for the next 2 years and 3 months that I'm going to be in office. And I'm excited about that because no state in the union can boast the numbers that we boast of in voter registration or voter participation. No state in the union.
Well, I would agree with the secretary on that. He's done a good job since he's been in office of publicizing what takes place in the office of Secretary of State. The only place where I differ with you, Mr. Secretary, is this. Be a little more progressive in terms of working with us on the laws, to change the laws, to make it easier, to continue to make it easier, to comply with the Alabama Constitution. That's what I'm asking for, is use the platform that you have to eliminate some of the things, and you know what I'm talking about. You know that there's still in Alabama people. See, I see that smile on your face. You know what I'm.
But
But I want to ask this. I want to ask this question.
To review the laws that are on the books, we have to continue to try to find ways to work together. And one of the things I think this pandemic is going to do is it's going to put us in a position to introduce some new conversations to members of the legislature, because you know as well as I that with the Republican legislature controlling the business in Montgomery, in order to change the election laws, you have to give significant reasons why those changes will benefit all voters in the state. And of course, you and I have worked together on accomplishing that mission in the past. I think we'll be able to do so in the future. But we need to make sure that we're doing those things for justifiable reasons that benefit all voters in the state. And I think when we do that, it's difficult for anybody to stand up and say, I'm opposed to this.
I do want, go on, Representative Knight.
For a reason, and that justifiable reason, and I ask you to continue to work with us on that, is the Alabama Constitution, the right that we have in this state to vote. I never will. I'm going to continue that. We have a right in Alabama, and I'm proud. I want the nation to know that we have a right in Alabama to vote. We just got to get our Democrat and Republican legislators together and make certain that we are allowed to exercise those rights.
I do want to ask this question, and this is for all three panelists. And I understand that everyone is, well, both Ishman and the secretary are constrained by the legislature and the laws. But given your view of the legislative or the voting process in Alabama, what changes or what modifications to the system do you think could be or should be implemented in the best world scenario that would make the voting system in Alabama more efficient and more accessible? And we'll start with you, Secretary Barrow.
Well, one of the things that I think we have to continuously revisit is the reason that some of the laws are on the books, because there's been times in the past where certain laws have been passed for certain reasons that may not be necessary anymore. For example, one of the things that I have been a proponent of is revisiting why we actually have the excuse provisions on the absentee ballot. Because one of the things we've shown is that people will mark a box if you ask them to, as we have this year, when we've said, please check the box that says I'm ill or infirmed and unable to appear at my polling site on election day. In doing that, everybody is able to mark the same box and everybody is able to use that as an excuse. But I asked circuit clerks one time when I had all the circuit clerks together, I said, tell me the people that mark the box that says I'm going to be out of town on election day, people that mark the box that says I have to work a double shift, people that mark the box that say I'm going to be out of town away at school. Have you ever checked on those people to see whether or not they're actually gone? They said no. I said, then why do we have the excuse provisions on there? If they're not serving a useful purpose, why do we have them? So I think that's something that needs additional debate and discussion in the Alabama legislature. I don't know why certain people want to keep certain things just because they've always been there. One of the things that we have to do is we have to be cognizant of the reason to change in order to improve the process. And that may be one of the things whose time has come to revisit in the 2021 session.
Okay. Representative Knight.
Yeah, The secretary and I can agree on that. We can start from that premise. I mean, they are on there for one reason and one reason only, to deter people from voting, to make certain that you question when you mark down, you want to make certain that you're going to be out of town on election day. I mean, that's in the minority community, I can tell you exactly. And because of some of the things that's happened in the past, people have been very reluctant. And they want to make certain that if they mark something that is accurate, and if they say they're going to be out of town, they're going to be out of town, or whatever the case might be in terms of all the different reasons. So if we could eliminate that, I think that would be very helpful. That would be a start, Secretary. I'd be happy to work with you on that.
Ms. Ishman.
Yes, I would love to see a no excuse absentee voting process. I think from what we're seeing right now with the absentee voting process volume, where pretty much it's the no excuse, but they still have to check that box. That excuse is that COVID. We're seeing that people want to do this. And I think hopefully I see after this 2020 election that the legislature can look at changing that. I would love to see a no excuse absentee voting process. Because, you know, you're right, John Mayer, we do not, if they say they're out of town, we don't ask them for a flight itinerary. You know, we don't ask them for their work schedule. But voters are concerned, especially when they have to sign that affidavit envelope, that when they're attesting to the truth of that, even with this state of emergency, that the voters can check that second box on that affidavit, they're still reluctant. And I said, hey, I have that state of emergency order in my office to show them, but they're still scared. They're scared to check that box. I have seen them write a whole summary on the back of that affidavit just because they're scared that they would have some legal issues surrounding that. So I would love to see that.
Don't you agree with me? I think it would be very unusual for us ever to have a situation in the future where we would have more people desiring to vote absentee in person than we have this time, or more people to vote absentee. That's the reason why I think it's a time for the discussion to take place, because the likelihood of us ever being in a situation where more people will want to vote absentee than they want to vote absentee now is very unlikely. And I think the empirical data backs that up. Don't you agree?
Well, we've seen, you know, there's been more voters this time who have voted the absentee process. And I would tell you, most voters, when they come into at least Montgomery County and they are concerned or not sure how this process goes, when they leave, they say, that wasn't that bad. That was easy. And so, you know, hopefully those who had some uncertainties about the absentee process initially see that it does work, that they will take advantage of the process in the future. I don't know if we'll ever see the numbers that we're seeing now in future elections, but I'm excited about the momentum that we're seeing as the absentee election manager for people choosing to vote the absentee process. I've never seen 13,000 absentee ballots that I've sent out. I will say, and I was in the absentee voting office in 2016 for the presidential election in 2020, and we did 5,000 ballots. And so we've already exceeded that, and we exceeded that that mark 2 weeks in.
We're gonna
indication that people really want to vote early. Absentee has been a stigma in terms of whether or not you're actually going to be absent from the city or the county at the time of the election. But there are many people that would want to vote early, vote convenient when they're off work or off the job, that they would take advantage of early voting vis-a-vis absentee voting.
we're gonna wrap up here. We have just a few minutes for each one of you to give just a 1 minute summary of your thoughts as we conclude our program. I'm going to go in reverse order. We'll start back with Ms. Ishman. Mrs. Ishman.
Okay. Well, like I stated earlier, we are excited. I am anticipating that we will have close to 20,000 absentee ballots in Montgomery County. And that's just me doing the calculation of our daily numbers. So we are hiring additional people. We are going to ensure the citizens in Montgomery County that their absentee ballots will be counted on election day. The governor has allowed us to start, those poll workers to start at 7 a.m. in the morning on election day. And so at 7 o'clock, absentee polls will close, and that those numbers are the numbers that they will see on election night. And so I appreciate the opportunity being here. Again, if you are interested in absentee voting, the deadline is approaching. We're about 15 days away. October 29th is the deadline to vote by the absentee process. If you already have your absentee ballot, you need to hand deliver that to your absentee election manager by November 2nd by 5 o'clock. Or if you choose to put that absentee ballot in the mail, it must reach us by 12 o'clock noon on election day. So we're happy to serve Alabama, and I'm grateful to serve the citizens of Montgomery.
Thank you. We'll go with Representative Knight.
Hey, I like absentee manager in Montgomery for doing an outstanding job of publicizing what's taking place and getting people to vote absentee. I think the Secretary of State has worked with us to a limited capacity to increase absentee voting here in the state. The biggest thing I think that we need to look at is how do we make it easier? How do we make certain that we guarantee people in Alabama the right to vote as stated in the Alabama Constitution? And you do that by making certain that the laws are not prohibited, that it does not prohibit the people from going to the polls and voting, and voting in a convenient manner. This is something that I think we work on. I think the Secretary has said that he's willing to work on it, on the excuses, because they put excuses on the ballot, but nobody go and check it unless there's a contest. And if there's a contest, then I'm certain that some of that may take place. And that is what really worried people about absentee, because the concept of absentee is that you're going to be absent. And that's why you find that stigma that's attached to it. Now, with this virus, it has brought to light some things, and I think that the Secretary, I hope, will agree with this, that we were able to do some things in this election that we've not been able to do before. So let's use that as an example of how we can look at the existing laws and change those laws that need to be changed and are outdated, and make certain that it's easier for people to vote. I think the most precious right that we can have of all the rights that we have is the right to vote, and especially here in Alabama and Montgomery in particular. Because there are people before us that marched, that fought, that died. They didn't have the right to vote. It was so difficult. Much of that has changed, but some things still remain the same in terms of trying to put obstacles up there. And having those things on the absentee ballot where you got to have a reason to vote absentee, it handicaps people from voting absentee.
It seems like there's some unanimity on that point. Secretary Merrill, can you please wrap up our conversation?
Yes, look, I'm excited to have had the privilege to have this conversation today. I think we can only improve our elections process whenever we're willing to come to the table and talk about the issues that are so very important to all of us. We need to figure out how we can be more effective administrators of the election process. I know that we continue to break records when it comes to voter registration and voter participation. We're going to continue to do that because it's a priority for me, it's a priority for our office. But when we have interested legislators and interested citizens who want to come together to work to improve the process overall, I think the only thing that can happen for Alabama is that we can all get better and we can all benefit.
Thank you so much. And thank you, panelists, for participation. Your comments were well received. I think it's been informative. I want to thank our viewers and participants. This concludes part 2 of our civic engagement in the COVID era and beyond panel series. Join us for part 3, Racism and Home Rule, the Alabama Constitution, Past and Present. This program aims to provide the historical context for the 1901 Alabama Constitution. It addresses Amendment 4, which is on the Alabama 2020 ballot, and which is deals with the Alabama Constitution and language in the Alabama Constitution. And that program intends to analyze the political constraints and any benefits accrued by the Alabama 1901 Constitution.